All right, here we go. Welcome, everybody, to Podcast Answers. That's right. We are a show that helps people start and grow their podcast, answering any podcasting questions along the way. So, welcome back, guys. There's so much going on in podcasting right now. It's incredible. There's lots of people starting video shows because they hear that YouTube is going to be doing podcasting. That's not what we're talking about today, though. We are going to be talking about how often should you produce an episode? How often should you put that episode out? How often should you record? So, first, I want to ask a favor of you, though. We are in need of a Rodecaster Pro 2 for the studio here. If you've received any value from this podcast, please consider helping us out by donating a few dollars, or if you want the whole amount. Only you know how much value you've gotten from this podcast. So please go to podcastanswers.com/helpout to donate today. And we would love it for that because we want to make our sound even better, have more control over the way that we produce this show. Right now, I'm doing it hard with a little cheap USB audio interface, and I would love to have a Rodecaster 2 for this show, just to make it a little bit better, to make it a little bit easier to produce the show and get a good quality sound for you. So again, if you've received value from this podcast, please consider donating either a few dollars or the whole amount. Only you know how much this podcast means to you. So podcastanswers.com/helpout to donate today. So how often should you release a podcast episode? There's no rules in podcasting. You don't have to have a weekly show. You don't have to have a monthly show. You don't even need to have a yearly show. You could do an episode as often as you want or as little as you want. Now, depending on what you do is going to have an effect on how many listeners you have and how effective your podcast is. But with that being said, though, there are a few things that you should be considering when you are considering doing a podcast. So how long are your episodes? If they're 3 minutes in length, it's probably going to be okay if you want to do it really often, if you want to do it daily. A lot of daily shows are quick, dirty tips, just something that can get in and out within a few minutes. People can consume them on their drive to work really easily, or when they're doing whatever, because it literally takes 30 seconds or a minute or 3 minutes, however long your show is. But those short bite-sized shows are going to be a lot easier to produce if your shows are short. If you've got long shows, it may take a long time to produce and then take up a lot of your time. So you may want to consider doing those shows like weekly or bi-weekly. So the other thing you can consider too is, what topics are you going to be covering? Is there enough of that topic to talk about an episode every week, every 2 weeks, every day? There may not be enough topics to talk about. Now, in podcasting, there are a lot of things to talk about. So I'm doing this show about podcasting, and there are lots of podcasting topics to talk about. I don't know that I could do a show daily, but there are people who do shows daily, but they're more talking about the podcasting news. So you need to decide if there's enough topics to talk about. I don't think I could do this show daily for several reasons, but mainly because there's not enough necessarily to talk about every day to put an episode out. And I don't think I could condense this down into 30 seconds. These shows are not very long. They're 10 minutes, 14 minutes, 20 minutes, but they're not super long. But I don't know that there's enough topics to cover every day to do a full episode about it for me. So I chose to do mine weekly because because I want to do it weekly. Lots of shows come out weekly because people build you into their schedule. But another thing to consider is, how long does it take you to produce the show? If it's going to take you a long time to produce the show, you're going to probably burn out because you're doing it too often. So one of the things to consider is, can you, how long does it take you to produce that show? If you have a show that's 2 hours long and you're just talking and talking and talking, but then you can immediately put it out because you're not doing any episode, you're not doing any artwork, you're not doing any editing like that, those can be easier to produce, but you have to kind of decide how you want your show to produce. And if you can produce your show with the quality that you want with, little time to produce it. So for some people, like Adam Curry, for instance, he literally, he does a lot of pre-prep work as far as collecting the data he wants to talk about, but he gets on and he talks for a podcast, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours. That's a long time to talk, but he's also used to doing radio shows. Those guys talk a lot. Those guys are able to carry on topics from A to B to C, and they can do it, but he doesn't do a lot of post-production on it either. He gets it out. It's, it literally hits his feed within, 30 seconds or a minute after he's done recording. And so it's available right there, right then. So not only how long does it take you to produce, but can you get away for that amount of time too? So for my other podcast that I do, a podcast called Dudes and Dads Podcast, we do it every other week because it's a show that I have to leave the house. I go to a different studio to produce, to record it. And so for me, I've got to be away from my family. And so I didn't want to take a weekly time away from my family every week. So it's every other week recording for me because that's the way that it fits into my schedule. So for this show, I do it right in my house. I do it right at my desk. But my other show, again, I do it in a different studio. I do it in front of, I have to go away for that. And so I don't want to get that affects my family time, and I don't want it to affect my family time. So how long can you get away for the time that it takes to actually produce the show? And then again, if you do something too much, it can cause burnout, especially if you end up doing more and more things with it. You create episode art, you create you have to do more editing, you have to do more post-production. Like, those things can cause you to burn out. And so if you don't want to burn out, don't produce an episode too quickly. Writing the content for podcast episodes can take a while, and those things can burn you out. And so you don't want to do that. Get yourself in a rhythm and make it so it works for you, so that way it's not going to cause you burnout for that, and you can continue doing your show for the long haul. And one last thing to consider is, too much content can be hard for your listeners to handle. And I say that because they may have, you don't know how many things that they may have be subscribed to. They may be subscribed to Joe Rogan and No Agenda and some shows that are going to be longer in length. And they may not have to 2 3-hour shows or 1 3-hour show. They just may not be able to get that down. I know I can't. I don't have the time to listen to a 3-hour podcast episode produced twice a week. But so you don't know what your listeners are going to be listening to. You don't know what else they're listening to, but just have to kind of keep that in consideration, that too much content can be hard for your listeners, and they may end up, every time they see your episode, just deleting the episode because they don't have time for it this week. They don't have time for it this week. So they slide and delete your episode. But then the next thing you know, they're unsubscribing because they've slid to delete your episode 4 times now. They've not listened to it 4 times because you're producing content too much. So again, that's something just to consider when you're deciding how often you should to do your episodes. But the main important thing is, no matter what you decide, be consistent with it. Be consistent with it. You don't want to 1 week put out 3 episodes, the next week you skip, and then you do 1 episode, and then you skip 3 weeks, and then you do another episode. It is okay to take a break. Let me say that right now. It is okay to take a break when podcasting, but you need to let your audience know that first, and you need to have a defined time when you're coming back. So 1, you need to let your audience know. 2, you need to have a predefined time that you're going to be coming back, that you're going to tell them that you're coming back. There are plenty of podcasters that I know that take breaks, and some of them unexpectedly, and that's okay. But they usually let their audience know that they're going to be out for a while, and so their audience knows that there's not going to be an episode, and the podcaster is coming back. So, with that, there is just one more thing for me to tell you. What do you think of this? How often should you produce an episode? Go to podcastanswers.com/contact. We would love to hear your thoughts on this, or you can join us on our social media sites. You can follow all of our socials at Podcast Answers or Podcast Answers 1 on Twitter, because I couldn't get the Podcast Answers on Twitter. So Podcast Answers is all of our socials. Tell us there, send us a DM, tell us in the comments for this episode, what do you think? How often should you produce an episode? Guys, with that, I am going to be out of this. I'm going to be out of here, and we are going to be we'll come at you next week. Guys, if you've not yet gone to our YouTube channel, go over to youtube.com/podcast answers, and you can see all of the videos. There you go. Muted myself. We do this thing live every week on YouTube, and we would love to hear your thoughts on it. So we would love to have you watch, because you can, as we're recording this, you can go and watch us and comment and bring it into the show, guys. Have a great week.